Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to the third teach-in series, Taking Action for Racial Justice. This is actually the final session of the Racial Justice teach-in series, so we hope it helps us lay a foundation for all of the other teach-in programming that we do, because we want racial justice to be at the core of how we're thinking about our work. But today, I'm really excited that we're gonna explore the strategies and tools that will help us work together in order to integrate some racial justice measures into our ministries. And we're going to be featuring the brilliance of two co-panelists today with Annanda Barclay and Mamie Broadhurst, both of which have helped their congregations taking some actions around racial justice. So Annanda is certified ready to receive a call and under the care of Mission Presbytery. She got her MDiv from Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Austin and is a Forum for the Theological Exploration Ministry Fellow. She is currently the 2016 and 2017 pastoral intern at First Presbyterian Church in Palo Alto. And there's more about her on our website as well. And Mamie is the pastor at Covenant Community Church in Louisville, Kentucky. She has previously served with the Presbyterian Church USA as a mission co-worker in Colombia, South America, and a young adult volunteer in Guatemala. I'm so excited to have the two of you sharing your wisdom about the work you've done in your own congregations.
So just so y'all are aware, our slideshow has a setup of an order of worship, so you'll know kind of how we're moving through. So look out for that. So right now, introductions have just been done, and let us begin with prayer. Gracious and glorious God, who brings us together to do your work, be with us in this time of fellowship so that we may learn from one another to continue to fight the good fight. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Amen. All right.
So a little bit about who we are. We have done some pieces of the introductions, but want to also tell you a little bit more about ourselves. I'm Mamie Broadhurst, and I am a white, heterosexual, cisgender female who grew up in the Presbyterian Church in North Carolina. And I'm a part-time pastor of an impressively small but mighty congregation in Louisville, Kentucky called Covenant Community Church, and we are a part of the More Light Network, and have been a part of doing some more work on racial justice in a more active way since starting at this congregation, and we'll get a chance to talk more about that. But Annanda, back to you.
All right, so my name is Annanda Barclay, and I am Black, African, Caribbean American. I'm queer, cisgender female who also grew up in the Presbyterian Church. I'm third generation Presbyterian in my family, out of a all African American congregation in the South Side is where I began to get my Presbyterian identity. I grew up a little bit of everywhere in Chicago, Illinois, North Atlanta suburbs mostly. And I am the pastoral intern for First Presbyterian Church in Palo Alto, which is a medium-sized congregation. It has about 150 members on the rolls, but on any given Sunday, it's between, somewhere between 60 to 90 folks in the pews. And yeah, Palo Alto, and we are about 90% white, a lot of Asian Pacific Islander, a lot of Afro-Caribbean, and a lot of folks from like Scotland, Ireland, and such. Or enough to be diverse in the Presbyterian context.
So as Annanda already said that we are going to be doing this sort of order of worship and want to show you all briefly, just take you where we're going to be going. So we've had our introductions and prayer. I want to tell you a little bit more about our contexts, and then starting the conversation will be about how these conversations did get started for us in our current contexts. Move on to talking about some resistance that we experienced and what to do in the face of that. about our failings and future frontiers, where we see ourselves and our congregations going as we move forward, and then to close ourselves in prayer. And if you all do have questions as you go, you can put it in the chat. If we can manage to fit in answers to it, then we will, but there is the follow-up on Thursday when there's the chance to ask more questions and have more conversation between folks that log back in on Thursday. So to tell you a little bit about my context, again, with Covenant Community Church, my church is just about 17 years old. It was begun as a new church development, mostly geared towards reaching out to young adults in the year 2000, and then became officially a church in the year 2010. So we're pretty young. We're also young, both in terms of years that the church has existed, but also young in terms of the folks that are out in the pews. Most of our people are between 30 and 50. Our oldest member is, I think, 55. And so we don't look a lot in that way, like a lot of other Presbyterian churches. We're about half Presbyterian, people that grew up and would have identified as Presbyterian, about half other folks, many of those who would probably say that they had been harmed by church in the past. And so CCC has been a way for them to come back into a place called church. I might call them holy skeptics, who might or might not identify as Christians on any given day. We are a member of the More Light Presbyterian Network, and so that is one aspect that skews us liberal, and I would say generally people would identify as such. We're probably about 96% white, middle and upper class, and we have we get super excited if we have 60 people in worship. So we're more along the lines of 40 to 50 people, and that's pretty active folks. So that's folks on the rolls and folks that are coming, by and large. We have a wider digital electronic network of folks, but in terms of the membership, which gets cleared out every year, then we're about 40, 50 folks.
Yeah, in my context, we're upper middle class, in some cases wealthy. We are stereotypical in that we're an older congregation. I'd say our average members range between 50s all the way up into 80s. So in that context, we're very stereotypically Presbyterian at the moment. We have a long history of social justice at our church. Church has been around since the early 1900s, very active in the civil rights movement and LGBTQ movement. It's one of the first More Light churches, and we're still a More Light church. Our church just made a declaration to be a peace church, to help folks who do not wish, or conscientious objectors for the draft. So in general, the church is very, very active when it comes to being known as a very liberal, very progressive church. Out of my context, I would say one of the things is we struggle with as a church or a growth area is centering, and we have great worship, but I think you'd go to other churches and you'd see a very clear biblical grounding. At our church, it's not necessarily so. So you'll see a lot of folks who are been Presbyterian for a very long time, and similar to Mamie's church, you'll have folks that are either other or Jewish, or have been hurt by the church. So we're an interesting mix, a very, very interesting mix. Yeah, I think that's a good place to stop.
And how would you say, Annanda, that things got started in talking about race and all this at your church?
That's a great question. So things got started, so when I got to the church, there was a Black Lives Matter flag posted on the outside of the church. And as I began to do my one-on-ones with folks there, and one-on-ones, for those of you who don't know, is as the new intern, I began to meet with people individually in the congregation just to get to know them as individuals, get to know what their experience of the church was, and also allow them to get to know me, to question me. And so throughout doing about a month or two of one-on-ones and getting to see how certain committees, active committees of the church work, is our social justice committee, which would be the equivalent of most people's mission committees, is very, very active. And so I saw that they had tackled everything on their list when it came to immigration and, you know, a whole slew of other issues, with the exception of incarceration. And there was one other thing, but in particular it affects African Americans, Black people. And after doing one-on-ones, I realized that a lot of people recognize this, and there was kind of a silent shame about it. And one of the great histories of the church that I was at, or that I'm at now, is that they've had a great history of adult studies, very rich adult studies. And so I found a need that was already there, a desire that was already there. And instead of it being all my baby, I found a way to plug and talk deeper about racism and white supremacy through the gap that was already there in the church.
Gotcha. I think interestingly, as Annanda and I were talking and preparing for this, one of the things that we reflected on was that a particular way that we wound up introducing or having this conversation was through those structures that you mentioned about things that existed and like the adult ed forum, things that folks recognized and that they knew to be ways of accessing information in their church, as well as then, you know, this sort of stated and recognized need that Annanda was able to lift out and see. My situation didn't come into so much of a recognized need exactly, although folks were certainly willing to listen. I came back, as Alex introduced me, I served as a mission co-worker in Colombia, South America, for several years, coming back in 2012. And so I returned from overseas in the same year that Trayvon Martin was killed, and when the news, mass media began to focus much more on the extrajudicial killings of African Americans, whether that was by police, which actually became a focus later than that, or whether it was by other folks, in that case, George Zimmerman, folks that took sort of vigilante justice as they chose. And I began working at Covenant Community Church at CCC in 2013, really the month before George Zimmerman was acquitted. And so when he was acquitted, and because that had been such a focus of news, that was news that required discussion. And I went to McCormick Seminary, and I grew up in a church that had this sort of you know, the typical expression of preaching with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other, that sense that you cannot separate life from the biblical witness, and so, or biblical witness from life. And so began to essentially engage in what you might call pulpit advocacy. So again, I'm a part-time pastor in a very small church. And so the time that I had to put forward into this, we don't have a lot of adult education series things. So that opportunity that Annanda has in this sort of richer environment that she has already built in that church isn't available to me. And so starting something wholly and anew and inviting people seemed even more complicated. And so my in this case, and my primary relationship with folks, especially at the beginning, was on Sunday and through the pulpit and having conversations there and bringing it into worship. And so we began to talk about things about race and about trying to build people's vocabulary in the midst of doing our regular worship and having that happen in various parts of the worship process, but also certainly in the sermon. That happened in a lot of different small ways, tried to build up people's vocabulary. One of the things that I think is difficult, especially for white people, if they have not been already doing some work on racial justice, on doing some kind of exploration of their racial identity, of our racial identity, is that oftentimes we don't have a vocabulary that's built up. Folks who have been on these previous webinars have had the chance to listen to Jessica Vasquez-Torres and Molly Castile, and listening to them talking about vocabulary and building up, talking about white fragility and talking about all sorts of different pieces that we began to talk about little by little in our worship process itself. And some of that, a fair amount of that happened as I took the congregation along with me as I was learning in some of these things. And so there was an aspect of vulnerability that I intended to show really all the way along. You might talk with them about how effective they all felt that was. That'd be another good follow-up webinar. But at any rate, you can see are they seeing what's on the screen right now with the pictures?
Yeah, they can see that.
So just to give you a sense, Annanda's church is on the left and my church is on the right, probably.
Yeah, correct.
My church is outside and Annanda's church is inside in this particular slide. My church actually is not Bardstown Road Presbyterian, which is there. That's the church where we meet. We are small enough that we just rent space in another church. And so that's us outside after having put up a Blessed Ramadan sign and wanting to sort of take a picture of that. That's not all of us, but it's a lot of us. So we're not a big church. At any rate, in doing that sort of conversation from the pulpit, some of that built to what I would say the longest sustained conversation that we had was during Lent of 2015. And in that, having already talked about a number of different pieces, we did this series in which, through an idea that I really got from Princeton Seminary and their partnership with the Black Studies program and Black churches in the area, they chose to do a 7 Last Words series, but instead of using the 7 Last Words of Christ, they did the 7 Last Words of African-American men and women who were killed by police or vigilantes. And when I saw that and looking for at my Lenten series, I'd said we were going to do the 7 Last Words of Christ. Just as I'm working on the sermon, I ran across that, and I was really convicted by that, and convicted by the sense of needing to have some more to say. And so we did that year a mashup, and that's what you're seeing on the screen now. You see the words of Jesus beside the words of different African-American men and women. Those are noted at the bottom underneath the dates, who said those particular things. And we did that for the 6 weeks of Lent, and then our church has on Saturday night before Easter a vigil, and we camp out. And so that's when the last one happened. And I will say that I think that folks really felt like Lent that year. They were really ready for Easter when it came around at that point. And so but what we did also in going through that was, again, in the sort of building vocabulary, started out in talking, we got people to say folks' names, right? We got folks to know these stories a little bit better. We got to talk a little bit about, again, some vocabulary pieces in going through, and also to share our own stories. Some of what happened was to share stories about ways in which race had impacted me. That was the first one, was doing a sermon related to that. So folks could hear how that had affected me. Growing up in North Carolina, there was no way that I wasn't going to have experiences that impacted me with regard to race, and really for anyone. And so getting people to think a little bit about that, and then move that into ultimately talking about going from the personal into the structural. By the last 2 or 3, we were talking much more about structural racism, and about how even if we are not participating in terms of saying, bad things about people or endeavoring to do something on a personal level, that we have benefits and structures that benefit us if we are white, and got around to being able to talk about the concept of white supremacy with folks, which again, over time, that was really important to get around to. That's not something you can bring up on the first week. It's not a straightforward thing for white people. And so it was a slower process, but that opened us up to a whole group that wanted to get together and do conversations about racial justice, again, building on structures that already exist. Our church was built off of intentional communities and having kind of like small groups. And there was a group that wanted to form to talk more and explore about racial justice and to read and to do their own internal work. And so that group formed shortly after that series and began to do racial justice reading and conversations that ultimately just resulted in November of this past year, a series that they put on by themselves, for which I was incredibly proud. I did not even attend the series, but the sense of they went out and invited people to come and talk about race and to have further conversations. So 3-week series in which they led some conversations about race, which I thought was great. So that as a part of that was what I was very proud of, was the movement of that from the pulpit then into the congregation. That was really a lot of using the structures of intentional communities moving forward in that.
Yeah, and I think to kind of, for my particular experience, actually one of the amazing things about my church is they're down for anything. So I have folks who are really big on action and what they're big on doing. And so the neat part about this series is, for me as a woman of color, to do this in a predominantly white congregation, well, first things first, I need to make sure, staff isn't scared, spooked at what I might be doing. And luckily for me, I have a staff who has actually worked a lot through their own privilege and guilt, enough to really be encouraging, and I feel safe and confident for the content that I'm putting out and don't feel like I have to check it with anybody, which is, I think, crucial, because a lot of white fear can play a role in how we talk about race, especially for me as a person of color. And so that for me was crucial, and knowing that I had a church whose background is about doing and being, and they're open to trying new things. And I think a lot of that has to do with the internship program and just the nature of the community. So what I did with the filling the need with the gap with structures that were already there, I highly suggest this. I think it's a great way to get to do work. And I think those one-on-ones and getting to know people and the needs of the congregation, and the congregation getting to know me, and that trust, I think helped to mitigate fears enough to where people had the courage to take this class. And so what I did, similar to Mamie in terms of using the liturgical calendar, is I took the entire season of Advent and now into Epiphany for my adult study. And it's called Compassion, Spirituality, and Dismantling White Supremacy. And I'd like to point out, given on the spectrum of where your church may lie, that name, or dismantling white supremacy may be difficult for some churches. Like, I've been to other churches, and if I named white supremacy, people's hairs would stick up, right? And so be mindful that as a queer Black woman who's out and open, it probably takes a pretty liberal church to call a queer Black woman, right? So just be mindful of your context. And so since my church was used to doing, what I wanted to do is do more of an activism of consciousness and being. And so getting deeper as to why we do what we do, not just out of the idea of charity, of because it's the right thing to do, which, yes, it's a great right thing to do, but how is this also embedded in our discipleship? And how do you personally have something at stake with white supremacy? I think one of the biggest ways white supremacy gets perpetuated is the idea that it does not harm white people, which is a lie. White supremacy does harm white people. A lot of times it looks different, right? That harm is different, but it does harm white folk. And I'm a firm believer that if folks realize that something directly affects them, out of their own self-interest, which I think is a very neutral concept, they're more likely to do something about it. And they won't get tired so easily, right? Like, we've all heard this in the movement. I'm tired of hearing about Black Lives Matter. We move on to something else. As a Black person, no, because we've been gutted for over 400 years. Like, we're bleeding in the streets. I don't think there's an end to the hemorrhaging of Black bodies. And so how I've gone about this is, since Advent is a very busy time for the church and busy time for people in general, it takes 28 days to make a habit. So what I've done is taken the idea of compassion and gave everybody a working definition of compassion, and talked about how compassion is a holy thing. So if we look at the teachings of Christ, if you look at the teachings of the Buddha, Muhammad, if you look at Moses, if you look at mystics throughout time, the universal thing they all have together, no matter how they define love, is compassion. And so I took those 28 days and gave everybody a tiny moleskin journal and asked them to think about ways in which they see and experience compassion daily. If they write in the journal daily, some folks, you do what you have to do. So that way, when we met in small groups once a week, They weren't beholden to the people in their small group, which is something that's super common. They were able to share what they wrote from their journal. That way it allowed for more fluidity and their vulnerability. And then after we talked about compassion, and it coincided with the lectionary that we use. So it's looking at compassion through the lens of spirituality and discipleship. Now we're talking about dismantling white supremacy. And so last week, and there's a final class this weekend, it's been mostly re-education. So demystifying the history of the United States. So I've used Dr. Joy DeGruy, who works with trauma and PTSD. And she talks about, there's a thing called post-traumatic slave disorder, or post-traumatic slave syndrome, and talks about how the country, particularly white folk and African Americans, have PTSD that's been untreated since the foundation of this country, right? Because how could this not have a psychological effect? And so basically I'm re-educating my congregation on history of the United States and how we're fundamentally built off of the richness of our economy is built off of free labor through Black lives and the African diaspora, and how commercial real estate and the genocide of Native Americans is really the foundation of what made the United States what it is today, in terms of the economy and the government structure. And so kind of being really honest with that, and then taking them from that origin story based off of scholarly work, right? So that they can go and look at, and how that affects us today with Donald Trump, and how that affects us today with how we understand ourselves as Christians and our call to justice. So different from Mamie and going out and doing more active work, I've actually been trying to do like deep self-work with my community to evaluate their personal interaction with white supremacy and race, and then to get them to think about what that looks like for them as a community. So that in general is what we're doing. And I think it's super fruitful. I have 50 people signed up for that class. People come in and out based off how they're feeling that day. But it's a very vulnerable class, and there's a lot of courage there. And I didn't expect the response that I've gotten. And so this past Sunday, folks are wondering how we continue this, because as we all know, January 20th, Trump's in the White House, and Steve Bannon, who's alt-right, a known white supremacist, is going to be his chief strategist. And so mine is more of a being instead of to undergird the doing. But that's the main way in which I'm doing it in my congregation.
Annanda, if you could put the name of the author in the chat, I may mention something else, if that's okay.
Yeah, oh, please, go ahead.
So Annanda and I have some similar challenges in the sort of sense of folks grounding in the biblical text, which was one of the reasons why doing some of the preaching and relating these things to the word and to the message was part of what I found to be important and life-giving for me, but also a really helpful place for them to be able to go forward and say, oh no, this comes from a Christian space. This doesn't just come from a good person space.
Right.
I mean, good people space is good. But if we're at church, then we ought to talk about how this has some place and basis in the Christian story. But a piece of that, as Annanda said, so some of that we've done in the pulpit when she's been able to dig much more deeply in doing this education series. Again, my folks in the intentional community have done a lot more reading, although they have not done as much of it they've done much more of the personal exploration piece and the exploration of race and of racial identity stuff in the intentional community versus biblical study base in that intentional community. But what we've talked about, because this, again, can be a challenge for white folks particularly, is that we don't like to screw up. I mean, I don't know a lot of people that think like, I would love to screw up. But there's this sort of big fear, and especially around race and liberal folks around race, that you don't want to somehow suddenly be perceived as a racist. You don't want to, you don't want to make the error of saying something stupid. And so part of the going out and participating and trying and having folks go and do this sort of intentional community conversation, but with other folks publicly, was a real big step for folks to say, okay, we might not get this right and we may make mistakes, but we're gonna move and do something and break white silence. Like that was kind of the piece of their commitment in that. And some of the breaking of white silence on our part too. So we meet at 5 p.m. on Sunday evenings. And it turns out that just as it happens in Louisville, a lot of activism stuff happens on Sunday afternoons. That's a day that folks have picked along a spectrum, a lot of different issues. But particularly there's been a solidarity of the now Black Lives Matter chapter officially, which even before it was called Stand Up Sunday, and they met together on Sunday afternoons. Well, we can never do that. And so one of the benefits of being, Annanda and I talked about, there are some downfalls of being in a 50-person congregation, like will you exist next year? But some of the benefits of being in a 50-person congregation are that you can do some things that folks in really larger congregations have a greater challenge doing, such that we have on occasion in the week last summer in which Philando Castile and Alton Sterling were both killed within a day of each other. Then the Black Lives Matter chapter here also then said, okay, we're going to have a rally peace vigil thing that's going to be at 5 p.m. on Sunday afternoon. And, when I heard about that on Thursday, I just thought, I am not going to be able to be inside of our sanctuary talking about how we must participate and do things while there is a vigil happening at 5 p.m. at the same time. And so I wrote to Session and said, hey, so what say we go and just do the vigil out at, at that site? And they all wrote back and said, sure, let's give it a try. I also have a sure, let's give it a try congregation. And that's a bonus that not everybody has. And so we did that, and we had church, and we took communion out there because we have communion every week. And so we took bread and cup out there and offered bread to anybody afterwards that was there. Hopefully we did that in a helpful and a good manner. Might have to talk to other people about that too. But we marched and we walked and we came back and had communion and said a prayer and took that to be our church. One of the things that I will say about that is that you will not find a photo of that in our slideshow. And that is because we very intentionally did not take photos at that march. It wasn't about documenting our presence there. It wasn't about saying, look at what we're doing and putting that on social media. It was about being present in the moment and being supportive. And I think that's always a really, really difficult call to make, especially now with cell phones and with selfies and with public social media, and trying to decide what is signal boosting, right? I mean, like what's helpful to get the word out, and then what is, hey, look at the good white people out doing the things, or whatever it might be. And so part of it's just deciding like what is the right thing to do at this moment. And what we decided was that the right thing was not to put pictures out there. There were plenty of people putting pictures of the march, and that was fine. We didn't put pictures of ourselves at the march or of ourselves doing communion or something like that. Probably taking pictures and putting pictures of the march out there would be great. But I think that's always something to consider as you go out and participate in things too. How do pictures help serve the greater purpose?
Yes, I echo Mamie's, please think about that. Because please know that people of color are watching how you use those pictures. And I'm not saying that as like to shame anybody, but as a person of color, I look to see, we have white allies. Is this about like you being there and saying, look what I did? And you may be genuinely about the movement, or is this about the movement? So thank you for that, because I think that's crucial. And another note of difference that I want to bring out. So if y'all notice, I shared with you, I think 4 videos on YouTube, and these 4 videos are part of the content that I have worked with my class. You can tell the class is pretty academic in a sense. It really is like a college class. Like, I'm requiring them to journal and participate in those journals. Some of those videos I had for them were required videos to move on with the next portion of the class. And that was done mainly, even though it's a discussion-based class, is done to move people along. So if we're talking about dismantling white supremacy, I'm not talking about hemorrhaging. And what I mean by that is I want to go to the source of it and want people to see the origins of it, as opposed to just discussing, which has its place, right? But just discussing the outcomes of white supremacy. But where does it come from? Because people behave for a reason, right? People react due to certain things. And so I want us to get to think, why do people react the way they do? And kind of more in depth. And so with that, you'll see less movement externally with what I'm doing. It's really all pure internal work that takes a lot of courage. And one of the things that I've had to impart on my congregation, especially coming from it as a Black woman, is letting folks know, like, when it comes to white guilt, I can't really help my congregants with white guilt, because I don't have it, because I'm not white, right? And so I have a great pastoral staff who, I have my supervisors and the head of staff and pastor of communal care, who are taking on for folks coming to them about white guilt. I can give them resources, I can give them books till my Black skin turns blue, but I can't help them. And so kind of knowing my limits, and they've been super open and accepting with that. And also reminding them too that, like, white is good. And I don't mean white is good as over and above or anybody else or below anybody else, but I think one of the biggest issues that I've seen over the years in talking about white supremacy, and one of the main things that the white fear to try to compartmentalize it, let's not talk about this, but what about this? Somebody meant well. Reminding white folk that nobody can help how they came into the world, right? And you are created in the image of God, and the image of God is good, and you are good. That's been something that, as we've met in big groups, that I've constantly stressed, is that white is good, white supremacy is bad, and a product of white supremacy is your white privilege, which you cannot help because of white supremacy. And so breaking that down for folk, because I realize white guilt and white shame it's not helpful in that it can paralyze, for lack of a better word, action, and it's stagnant. Like, it's just not good. And also, in worst case scenarios, it makes it an issue again all about white people, and it's just not. And so that has been crucial for me, in terms of getting folks to open up and have the courage to open up and actually really wrestle with the hard stuff. Because I'm not just asking them to look in and see what's going on in the streets, but I'm asking them to look and see what's going on inside here and see how it hurts them. And that has been one of the biggest struggles that I've come across in seeing folks in my congregation, is struggle with how white supremacy hurts them, because they just see the benefits. And that's what I think one of the biggest ways white supremacy is perpetuated, is this idea that it's a all-winning game, right? And it's not true. It's really not true. And so I found that to be helpful. And again, in my particular context, I had a congregation that's open to experimenting. They got to know me, and I got to know them on an individual level. And of course, through my participation in worship and other life of the church that just happens with a pastoral role. So I'm aware of that. And I have a staff that was very trusting of me and said, go for it. So those are key components that allowed me to do this kind of in-depth, almost college-style setup of a class.
When Annanda and I were talking about this, we recognized a couple of things. I mean, we do have congregations that are open to this conversation. I mean, to some degree, my congregation she walked into a congregation with a Black Lives Matter sign, so knew that there was sort of fertile ground there in some form or fashion. I did not, but I walked into a congregation that was very grateful to have a paid pastor that was with them. As a part-time pastor, my income is very helpful to our family, but not critical for our eating food each day. I am married and have a partner that helps to make that happen. And so I had little to lose. And I think that's critical, that you know that I know that, right? So I could start with these conversations and I could piss people off if it came to it. And if they just asked me to leave, like if I misjudged them and their answer was like, get out, we're done, then I could be out and I would still be eating, right? So that's something, and recognizing that in terms of resistance, there are clearly varying levels of resistance. Now, I did get pushback from people, and during the Lenten series, there were folks that stopped coming to church. And I noticed that they stopped coming to church, and I called. And so because my congregation is small enough, then I could also say, hey, so I noticed you're not coming to church. I just wanted to talk about that. Is everything okay? And my version of one-to-ones, instead of being sort of on the front end, getting to know them at that point, as Annanda had the chance to do, mine was this sort of, I did already know them to some degree, and I wanted to go back and do pastoral care conversations about what is this pushing in you that's making you back away and making you say, this is not a conversation I want to have. And so I did have lunch and I don't know that all hearts and minds were changed in all of that, but everyone's still coming to church, so we're still having conversations together about what does this look like. And what I find is that a lot of the resistance that I wind up hearing as a white woman who is engaging a primarily white congregation is less anger than it is either that sense of guilt that Annanda speaks of, and just the wanting to disconnect from that. That goes back to Molly's conversation in the previous webinar about white fragility, and the sense that you have to build up muscles to be able to do this in ways that we've not had to do it. I mean, it's interesting to think of this sort of group that's gotten a great deal of privilege being incredibly weak in this particular area, but it's often the case. And because it's easy to ignore, then folks, once you start engaging, it's like other muscles and it begins to feel tiring. And so the sense of guilt that overcame, and folks wanting to avoid that feeling. The other thing was about, again, fear and anxiety on a sort of existential level, of the sense that maybe it is that I have some of the things I'm hearing I've never thought of, and what an idiot I am. Some of it is some of the things I'm hearing I just don't know what to do with. And how do I process that a little more? And so because in a smaller group, we could have some of those pastoral conversations. That was kind of my way of dealing with that resistance. And talking with Joey and Alex and Evangeline, some of the questions that have been asked in previous webinars afterwards were things like, what do I do if I'm not the pastor and my pastor is resistant to having these conversations and having me bring them up, or having some kind of educational study or doing something like that? What's the way to sort of erode that resistance? And to some degree, I think Annanda and I talking would say, we are not really great at being able to answer that question, because we were in to have the conversation, and we were in the positions, we had the privilege to be able to initiate those conversations, and the resistance was resistance we encountered from others, not from the leadership of the church. So that's a really different question, and it's one that's important to think about. I think probably having, what I would say, just based on any kind of thing, is having repeated conversations about where that resistance is coming from, in any case, is going to be a similar situation of trying to dig further into that, and what is that resistance, and what are the ways in which you can nibble away at that resistance. Having said that, church is not the only place to have this conversation. And so, Annanda, back to you.
Yeah, back to me. Yeah, so, we both have pastoral privilege, but I also want to stress the other churches that I've been to have been fantastic, but I probably would not have been able to do this adult study at other churches that I've been to the depth that I've been able to go. And so resistance for me looks a little different as a Black woman going into settings where most of my colleagues are, if not all of them, are white. And so because my colleagues had dealt enough with their whiteness, I've been able to do this study. So I want to stress that. And because my congregation has had a history, again, kind of going on with Mamie said, like, check to see where the resistance is. A lot of that has to do with your church history. It's systems work, right? It's who gets flared up about this idea, or what has that been like for your particular congregation? And odds are any new thing, right, or any sensitive, vulnerable topic, that same system will come up to try to resist it. So it is unique to white supremacy, but it's also just unique to sexism, right? To LGBTQ folk. It's the same, the origin is the same place. So if you're able to find out the historical origin, it's helpful in navigating that. So for me, I've found resistance in my context, not so much at this church, but there's low-hanging fruit outside of the church in a lot of ways, because you're starting with people who are new, you're starting with people who are fresh, and you're starting with a lot of communities or folks on an individual level who have a very single, narrow-minded understanding of church, and not narrow-minded in a bad sense, narrow-minded in that they've been spiritually hurt from the church. All they see of the church is extreme conservatism and fundamentalism, which they've seen on television. And also you have folks that have been hurt not just by conservative fundamentalism, but I will also stress folks that have been hurt by progressive fundamentalism. And this idea, Mamie and I talked to get to organize about this, of eating our own young. That's a thing. And some people in the progressive circles will leave and not trust church again. And so in many ways, when I worked at REI, for example, Recreational Equipment Incorporated, the outdoor store, because I'm super granola, I worked at REI, and a lot of the folks there were either what we call nuns or duns, right? But as they got to know me and talk to me, they realized, like, oh, there are aspects of the church that do care about racial justice, that do care about LGBTQ stuff, that see the complexity and the intersections of that. And in many ways, to be honest with you, it was easier to do ministry one-on-one, almost like a chaplaincy level, with them than it is in the four walls of the church. I'll be very frank about that. There's fluidity, there's flexibility, and there's an openness. With the church, we're dealing with history. I mean, there's a lot of different stuff. And so I stress not to just think that the church is the only place where you can do this work. And one of the big takeaways I have for my class, and I tell people all the time, is that we're all called, right? We know this as Presbyterians. We all have a call. So how does God speak to you? What is your gift? And what are you passionate about? That's one of the big things for my classes. I tell folks, all right, we're talking in general about the history of white supremacy. I mean, I'm a big picture person, so I'm giving them a lot of big picture stuff. But out of all of these big picture things, what in particular about white supremacy what about that gets under your skin? And what particular call to action do you have, and what gifts do you have as a person? Nobody can do you, nobody can be you ever again, right? Like, you were the only person, you were the only you for the entirety of human history, before you or after you. So what can you do with that? What can you do with that inherent gift that you already have of simply existing? And where do you find your passion within this work? Because I feel like that's the work that you're called to do. And how can I, as your pastor, as your friend, as your colleague, support you in that work?
And some of that may happen inside the church, and that's great. And some resistance in all of that is going to be natural, and we keep working against or with or against that. And then there's also the point at which you recognize that banging your head against a wall just makes it bloody. And right. So, there's a way to do other work and keep sort of having people watch your life. And then that opened up doors within your church because they see what's happening elsewhere. To tell you about some of our future sort of thoughts in terms of where we need to go as a church or what we're thinking, We've done a lot of work in talking about some of our own internal work about what do white people need to do, and talking about trying to build up the vocabulary, as I'd said. What we have not done as well are two different things. One is making sure to be able to keep this, expand it beyond a black-white dynamic conversation. There certainly are more people in Kentucky than folks that are black and that are white. There's a growing number of Latinos. We really do have a very small number of Asian Americans. But it is heavily depicted as black-white in my context particularly. That's probably a bit different in California. But in my context particularly, it is that way. So that's one of the pieces, is to be mindful of that. The second piece is that in Kentucky, it turns out that we are not a liberal bastion. And so, but Louisville is kind of its own bubble. And there are some good things about that, and ways to be able to work and figure things out on that front in a relatively safer space. But part of it's been figuring out, how are we going to break outside that bubble then? And how do we reach out to the wider presbytery, which covers a much greater geographical distance? And so talking about, where are there ways in which we can partner with other churches in the presbytery, so that we might be able to learn from each other and figure out, where are folks coming from that have a very different perspective, and where are we coming from, and can we recognize we're all Christians in the doing of that?
Yeah. I think for me, again, it's what does the congregation feel called to as individuals, and eventually have a collective communal identity, and clarity and discernment around that. Since I know that I'm an intern, I don't want to lead the congregation what I think is best for them, because historically I've found being intern at another church, that'll fail, right, if it's my baby. But if they own it and they come up with the ideas based out of their discernment from the fodder in this class, anybody can help water that garden, I think is great. And any connections that I can make as an intern with different communities is crucial. I think to again, offer a network within the Presbyterian Church. And then, the church is in Palo Alto, but East Palo Alto is predominantly Latino, Tongan, Pacific Asian Islander, and, historically Black community, right? And so how can I connect with those folks? And for us, it's not really the churches over there, because the theological spectrum is so wide on top of the socioeconomic spectrum. But, there's a center called the Ecumenical Hunger Program, and everybody can agree on folks need to be fed, need clothes, need shelter, and how you can work with a community center that's a nonprofit, which is based in faith, as opposed to maybe some of the historically Black churches in the area, where theologically it might look different. And also, me being a woman with some of those traditions is not the most helpful part, right? That's a reality. And so that's some of the things that I'm having the congregation look and think about as we have our next classes. How do they feel called, and how do they identify that? Because it's crucial. And one last thing, I did a study about 5 years ago with the Forum for Theological Exploration. It was a big fellowship. I got a massive grant. And what I did with that grant is I went across the country and looked at different churches, rural, kind of stereotypical, urban, for three things: sexuality, gender, and race. And what I found with all three of these churches is it took 3 years max for these churches to be integrated in what they desired, whether that was racial justice, whether that was LGBTQ, or whether that was more women on staff. 3 years max, all different sizes of churches, steeple, tiny congregation, and bigger one, right? It was like First Pres Albuquerque, Pasadena Presbyterian Church, and Madrona Grace in Seattle. Those are the three that I looked at. And so I say all this to say, there's a myth out there that all of this work takes a long time to do. But the reality is, if your congregation or your pastoral setting that you're in, if folks are really clear about their call and their mission in ministry, and they're in it together, at least from that small study that I did, all of those congregations influenced the local community and were not silos within 3 years. It did not take a long time. One of the myths that I heard in seminary was that it'll take decades, or No, that's a lie. It can happen quickly depending upon where you all are as an identity in a community. And so I want to stress that. All right, time to pray, Mamie. Okay, cool. It's me. I'm not putting you on the, but I was checking with you. Fantastic. Let us pray out. Dear gracious and glorious God, we thank you for this time together to learn from one another and what we're doing in our respective communities. We thank you for those who are on this call that are also trying to do the good work, and for the collective joy and power that we have to bend the arc of justice. And in Christ's name we pray, amen.
Amen. Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Annanda and Mamie. That was an amazing discussion. Thank you. It's incredible. Both Mamie and Annanda have given us amazing ideas and ways to think about how we can help our congregations and ourselves show up better for racial justice, both internally and externally. So I will close us out with that and just express my deep appreciation to all of you for joining us today. Thank you so much.